Good morning, and thanks for watching this West seasonal weather update. I wanted to start here today. This is looking at 500 millibar height anomalies, essentially our kind of trough ridge pattern. Now, this was from April 1st through June, so really kind of the April and May pattern that we were seeing across North America. And this was relevant to the West because we had this persistent troughing really kind of over the continental divide, the interior West. And what this did is it kept systems moving through the West, particularly the Northwest, where we saw cooler temperatures, lower than average accumulation of heat units and GDDs. And it was very different, right? Coming in through late spring, there were more systems coming through and less heat than we're dealing with now. Now, certainly as you go through the summer months, temperatures are going to naturally increase. That's just the climatological average. That makes sense from a seasonal perspective. But they've been even warmer than average, for the peak of summer. And it's because we've had this pattern shift. So this is looking again at those 500 millibar height anomalies, this time starting in June and lasting through July 15th here. So really kind of the last month and a half, if you will, through the summer months proper. And we've shifted that pattern around a bit. We still have this trough here, but it's anchored, more over maybe the central Canadian shield. And then this ridge that's built up, unfortunately, really right across the West Coast, across parts of California, Western Nevada, Oregon, and this has allowed heat to build in through this area. We've seen a number of days, and persistent days, in fact, where we've had excessive heat warnings over and over again. Heat advisories have been out, getting into even some of the coastal areas and the valleys there. So we've had this big turnaround, this big shift in the weather pattern from late spring to summer, and it's often kind of that transitional time period where we watch for these shifts. Now, a little bit earlier this year, right, while we were in that kind of cooler episode, if you will, in April and May, we were maybe a little bit more concerned with heat in the Four Corners region. We've certainly seen heat there. We've seen heat through the lower Colorado River Valley, but it has been a little bit more shifted over kind of the West Coast proper, kind of over the last month or so here, certainly as we've turned the page at the end of June into July. Now, the kind of late spring, early summer period I was just talking about, this is what the surface temperature anomaly map looked like for that time period. So cooler than average temperatures, in fact, across much of the western region, save for parts of the southwest. Now, obviously, we're dealing with a much different regime. Even today, if we jump over at the National Weather Service all hazards map as of this morning, early morning here across the west, again, we see these kind of bright red, pink colors. And I think we know what this means at this point here in July. We have more heat coming in. So we can see the excessive heat warnings out for parts of Southern California, Western and lower Arizona, parts of the Snake River Valley near Boise, and the middle Snake River, and then heat advisories out for some of the near coastal areas in Southwest and Central California as well. Heat advisories again, for Eastern Washington and parts of Northern Idaho. So heat lingering in through the middle of July, not as maybe extreme or as excessive as we saw it in the heat wave. That was very persistent and high amplitude at the beginning of this month. If we take a look at some of the temperatures here, these are maximum temperature, and then they're color shaded by anomaly. So you can see the absolute temperature there, what the actual air temperature will be. That is plotted there for a number of the cities here across the West region, but also colored or shaded by the anomaly here for the middle of July. Now, today, Thursday, you can see these warmer than average temperatures. That's why we saw that heat advisory out for Eastern Washington, parts of Northern Idaho, parts of Arizona and Southern California as well. So going to Friday and then Saturday, temperatures increasing into the weekend. So increasing even so for parts of the Northwest, increasing across parts of California, Arizona, Nevada, including Utah. And through the day Sunday, perhaps some of the highest temperatures here in terms of their anomalies in parts of Eastern Washington, Northern Idaho, Western Montana, parts of even Southern Idaho and Eastern Oregon as well. As we go into Monday, slight moderation of that heat across the Northwest. There's actually a trough here spinning off the coast of Oregon and Washington, and that's starting to influence those air temperatures here across the kind of immediate west coastal areas of Oregon and Washington. But the heat lingering in California, heat lingering in Nevada, and also parts of Arizona in through Wednesday of next week now, the furthest out this National Weather Service NDFD forecast goes at this point. Now, because of that, the National Weather Service hazards outlook for the 3 to 7 day time period has hazardous heat contours out for a number of the areas here across the West region for the Central Valley of California, through the lower Colorado River Valley, parts of Nevada, Idaho, Eastern Oregon, Washington, Northern Idaho, and Western Montana. All these areas seeing potentially hazardous heat as we go out into the work week next week. Now, it doesn't quite seem as extreme, like I said, like the heat wave that we saw in early July, but nonetheless still notable given that we are in kind of one of the hottest times of the year here in middle to late July as we work our way through the month. Now, the reason for this is the same reason we saw the heat in the early part of July. We have a persistent ridge that's built in across the western region, and it's just been hard to shake out of the area here in July. And if you look just kind of the height pattern valid as of this morning here on Thursday, you can see this large long wave ridge really centered right over the western half of North America. This heat has built into Canada at times. We're seeing a number of wildfires that have sparked up and have been burning very persistently in parts of northern Alberta and British Columbia. And that has, at times, because of the shape of this ridge and the winds around it, has blown smoke and wildfire smoke into parts of the USA, causing some hazy skies and some a little bit redder sunsets. Now, I'll take this forecast into the future through Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and you can see Saturday getting even more anomalous or a bit stronger here over parts of the northwest. That's why we're seeing those temperatures increase across parts of Washington, Idaho, parts of Oregon as well, lingering across parts of the southwest, albeit not quite as anomalous. Persisting into Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. You can see this trough that's been spinning just off the northwest coastline. That's getting closer and closer as I go out further into the future, further into the next work week as we turn that page. And that's going to help cool temperatures down along the immediate coastal areas in the Willamette Valley, parts of the SeaTac area, far western Oregon, which will see a break from the heat, unlike the interior, unlike places east of the Cascades here, where those warm temperatures are going to continue into next week. You can see even go down into Wednesday of next week, that ridge is still positioned there across parts of California, Nevada, and Utah. It's not as anomalously contoured as some of the other ridges that we can see here. For that reason, not expecting as extreme of heat or as its number of records to be broken. But nonetheless, like I said, it's July. This is going to be very warm weather. So go through the Thursday and then Friday. You can see that troughing here across British Columbia and Alberta getting more established. So when I started this forecast, we had this big long-range ridge across North America. It's not there anymore. As we take this forecast all the way out to next Saturday, we can see more troughing establishing itself across the western half of North America. Now, that would be good news for temperatures, but I have to say it would be because we're already out to Saturday at the end of July here, July 27th, the last weekend of the month. So this is a pretty long-range forecast at this point. It's getting out kind of beyond where that forecast accuracy confidence can reasonably land. So it's a hint. We could see this occur, maybe more likely than not that we get a break from the heat as we go in through the end of next work week out toward next weekend, seeing some model agreement here. But it's not set in stone. It's not something we can forecast with 100% certainty. But at the very least, unlike maybe the heat wave we saw in July, there is some hope on the horizon that we might see a moderation in temperatures as we approach the end of the month here. Climate Prediction Center's forecast for the end of the month here, their 8 to 14 day outlook, we do see the influence of that troughing here across the northwest with near normal or below normal temperatures for parts of Washington and Oregon. If we look across the west region proper, that ridge more centered over maybe southern Canada, the northern plains of the United States. We still see some heat here lingering across the four corners and not as excessive of heat here forecasted for folks in California or southern Arizona. They still are on the warmer side of the contour, and as persistent as this ridge has been across the west region, that would seem to make it a little bit harder to break down. So still a fork in the road in the forecast in terms of where we're going at the end of July, but at least not seeing it kind of an extreme persistent heat signal as we approach August here. If I take a look over at the precipitation forecast, as we build some heat north and as we get that ridging pushing up a little bit further north into Canada, that allows the monsoon to do what it does here at this time of the year in July and August, which is bring some moisture, thunderstorms, daytime showers, etc. into the area. So not seeing a weaker than normal monsoon forecast, that makes sense, maybe even a little bit slightly above average here in parts of Arizona and New Mexico. And then with that trough off the northwest coast, likely seeing just a little bit more precipitation than average for July here for some of the immediate coastal areas in Washington and Oregon. Now, I want to turn the page here a little bit and talk about where we're going in terms of the seasonal forecast, where we might be with the La Niña forecast. I mentioned a week or two ago that potentially could see La Niña strengthen a little bit because we were seeing a trade wind surge in the Pacific. And those trade winds, when they're a little bit stronger, tend to help move this colder water here in the eastern Pacific out into the central Pacific and can upwell some cooler water as well. And for that reason, we kind of watch for these trade wind surges to see La Niña strengthen. And we saw that a little bit. In fact, this is an area we've been looking at closely, kind of waiting for the colder water, which has been kind of held up over here in the eastern Pacific off the coast of Peru. It seems we've been waiting and watching for that water to start moving west, and we can see that now. We're starting to get some of these cool eddies, if you will, pushing in to the Central Pacific. In fact, if you kind of follow these eddies here, you can see them making their way across the Pacific, albeit not the largest cold signature. So we're no longer in an El Nino. We're not in a La Nina yet. If you average the ocean temperatures in here, we're actually just slightly below average. And the El Nino indices right now have us at neutral as a result of that. So not seeing a La Nina yet, but this latest trade wind surge got us a little bit closer. Now, another thing to look at is we've been watching the North Pacific, saw a lot of heat building into here recently as we kind of turn the page into July. It's still there, certainly northeast of Hawaii, as this is pushed further northeast. We have increased our concerns for heat across the immediate western region, places like California, Oregon, and Arizona, versus a little bit earlier this year when we were maybe focused more on the Front Range or the Four Corners area. We have seen some cooler water develop here just kind of over the last few weeks. A little bit colder signature here off the coast. Do see some of this warm water on the British Columbia coastline. But the fact that this kind of northeast surge, if you will, has failed to entrench all across maybe the Gulf of Alaska or all the way over to the East Coast, at least gives some hint that maybe we won't see as persistent of a heat signature in the immediate West Coast, maybe California, the coastal states, going out further into July and into August. That'll be something to watch going forward. If we look at the weekly forecast from the ECMWF, here just came out a few days ago, just yesterday even, this is the the temperature anomaly forecast for the month of August from the ECMWF forecast. And what you can see here is that a lot of heat is expected to continue across the west region going through the next month, maybe centered around parts of Montana or southwest Canada there, but nonetheless impacting a large part of the western region. So it's likely into August we're still going to see this anomalous heat, unfortunately, across the west region. That will likely elevate wildfire risks. That's going to be something we're going to have to continue to watch as we go through the year here, as that season, that wildfire season peaks a little bit later. In fact, some of these areas that had below average snowpack are a particular concern, I would think, in parts of northern Idaho, parts of Washington, especially western Montana, and even some of the higher elevations here in parts of southern Idaho or eastern Oregon as well. So unfortunately, kind of a chronic ongoing story we'll have to keep an eye on as we go through the summer here and get into the peak of the wildfire season a little bit later. I want to take a look at a different forecast here. This is from the Climate Prediction Center, their forecast that just came out this morning here, July 18th, and this is their temperature anomaly forecast for August. And it looks pretty similar to what we just saw from the ECMWF, and that perhaps that heat centered maybe more over the interior west, parts of Montana, Wyoming, Utah, but still warmer than average for many of the regions here across the west coast. What we're not seeing is this big kind of glaring heat risk signal across the west coast states. They are in just kind of the slightly above normal contour here. But again, with some changes in the Pacific and some of these long-range forecasts suggesting more heat over the interior, less of a concern for some of these persistent heat waves that we've seen in July persisting into August for some of these immediate west coastal areas. And you can see that too if I flip back to the ECMWF, still certainly warmer than average here in some of the areas across the west, right? But not as anomalous as some of the areas more into the interior. If we jump over and look at the ECMWF seasonal outlook, this is valid for August, September, and October, so kind of a late summer, early fall forecast. The forecast here has more of the heat centered around the Four Corners region. This was kind of a common forecast that we saw maybe for much of summer a little bit earlier this year, and we've seen heat in the Four Corners region, but that hasn't been where it's been centered, if you will. In fact, we've seen kind of the monsoon season picked up a little bit earlier. It's weakened here and there, but largely kind of been on schedule, I think, if not even a little bit faster than normal. So not sure how much weight I'd put into this forecast here. I think there's certainly heat risks that are going to persist in through late summer and early fall into parts of the interior northern west, Idaho, western Montana, and maybe even California and Nevada at times. But nonetheless, this is the latest forecast from the ECMWF seasonal. And then, with the heat center over the Four Corners region, if I jump over and look at the precipitation forecast for the same time period, you can see the below average monsoon expected through the last half of that season. And again, just based on what we've seen, which has been fairly regular monsoon at times with even some flood watches and flooding issues in New Mexico. Again, not sure how much weight I put into this forecast. This one has an asterisk, if you will, in my mind, because we haven't quite seen this pattern materialize yet. Another forecast from the ECMWF, this is looking at INSO, so El Nino versus the La Nina forecast going out through the end of this year. And what we can see from this forecast here is that a number of these members here are below average in terms of those sea surface temperatures in the Central Pacific. We just looked at those sea surface temperatures and saw those water temperatures decreasing, so this kind of downward trend makes sense. The ECMWF has been a little bit on the kind of moderate side in terms of the amplification or the depth of this La Nina. A non-insignificant or a significant number, if you will, here still have us, slightly above average. Even a few of these kind of, flirting with an El Nino potentially developing at the end of the year. I can't rule that out. I don't think that's going to happen. But this ECMWF forecast has been a little bit more on the neutral or the warmer side in terms of where we're going with La Nina, and has caused us to kind of pump the brakes a little bit on the La Nina chances this year. If we jump over and look at a number of different models here that forecast ENSO going forward, and I'll see if I can make this valid as of July here. Looks like these are updated just through June. But if we look at the latest June forecast for some of these ENSO forecasts going forward, what we're looking at is this negative 0.5 degrees Celsius range here. And a lot of these models here are still getting us below that La Nina threshold before the end of the year, so going into the next water year. So that remains kind of the expectation that likelier than not, we'll be seeing La Nina through the end of the year. But there are still some of these members. We saw this in the ECMWF. We can see it here where models are failing to have us get into a La Nina. So there's still this kind of open question as to, will La Nina develop? If it does develop, how aggressive will it be? Will it be one of these strong La Ninas where we perhaps see more of the textbook effects, or will it be a little bit of a weaker one or more of ENSO neutral situation, which could change the water year forecast, I think, pretty quickly. So this remains kind of a question that we want to try to figure out as we go through the year. La Nina is a tricky forecast. As those water temperatures cool into the Pacific, there's a reason there's a threshold here. It can get sticky once it reaches that kind of La Nina form. It's kind of this ocean and atmospheric feedback loop. So there's an event horizon, if you will, that once those temperatures cool down enough, it tends to feed on itself and they can get even cooler, which is why these ENSO forecasts going out into the future aren't terribly accurate. Because it's non-linear, right? It's hard to capture all of these, various feedback loops in some of these models here. So it's possible here that, we see La Nina develop, and once it really gets entrenched, it takes off, and we end up getting a pretty anomalous La Nina by the new year, and we're in the middle of, what could be a moderate or strong La Nina. So just because, all this, the envelope of models here keeps us, in this kind of neutral to slightly La Nina territory, doesn't mean that we can put too much weight into this. There are options and scenarios here that are very believable in my mind, where we could be outside of this envelope. So it's something to watch. It's a difficult forecast. If we look at the latest forecast from the Climate Prediction Center, they have been on the more aggressive side in terms of forecasting La Nina going out through the end of the year. So their kind of highest probabilities here through October, November, and December are at or above 80%. I don't think that's a bad forecast right now. It's something that's hard to forecast. I think, if you had asked me, I'm landing somewhere around 65%, certainly likelier than not, but it's not a home run at this point that will be in a La Nina at the next water year. One thing we watch for La Nina development, and I mentioned this earlier, are these trade wind surges, and we can track these and try to forecast these with Havmuller diagrams here. This forecast from the ECMWF ensemble. And what we're looking at here, I'm really kind of focusing on this area of the graphic. This is the wind forecast, those trade wind forecasts for the central tropical Pacific, where we're expecting La Nina to attempt to develop here. And what this graphic actually does is from the top to the bottom, it's going forward in time, and kind of conveniently plotted here on the black line is today's date, so July 18th. And what this tells us, and these color contours here, are where we've had these trade wind surges, particularly this blue area on the color bar. And we can see over the last maybe week or so that right in the Central Pacific here, and I'll kind of color this in, we've seen a big trade wind surge in the Central Tropical Pacific, and that has allowed that cooler water to help push into the Central Pacific, and we came a little bit closer to La Nina just in the last week or two. Now, going out into the future, we don't see as aggressive of a trade wind surge in this area in the forecast out through the end of July. So not expecting La Nina to significantly develop, at the end of July going into early August here. We do see a little bit of activity here, perhaps associated with an MJO progression into the Western Hemisphere. Nothing too significant here. So we'll be watching this as we go through August. If we get another one of these trade wind surges and a few of these on top of one another, that could tip us over, if you will, into this kind of feedback system where we suddenly quickly get ourselves into a La Nina, maybe going into September and October. So that's really where I'm watching it. It's kind of a delicate system here, and we'll be watching it closely. If we look over at the El Nino index, which tracks those ocean temperatures, we can see just in the last week here, we have decreased those ocean temperatures enough in the central tropical Pacific because of that trade wind surge to get us a little bit closer. But remember, that kind of La Nina threshold is here at minus ½ degree Celsius. So we have a ways to go before getting to it. And we've seen these kind of cooler waters stretch across the Pacific at times through the summer, but they haven't entrenched themselves, right? We see these kind of warm-ups back toward neutral or even slightly above average. So again, something to keep an eye on as we go in through the end of summer into fall here for the potential development of a La Nina water year for the western U.S., which would likely bring more precipitation, more activity, more snowfall to northwest states, some of the areas that maybe missed out on above average snowpack in the last El Nino winter. But unfortunately, it would bring back the prospects of drought for areas like California, Arizona, maybe the Colorado River Valley, which has enjoyed some nice water years here after their very low water levels and the drought that we were dealing with as we turned the calendar to this decade. That's the last slide here. I'll leave it here today. Thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you all soon.